The Circus peanuts, which are those neon orange marshmallows, which just look ghastly, but where'd you go with those?
I did orange muscat, something that people might not have had very often, but that's a literal orange and orange. You typically find them in California. The Circus peanut. It's round, it's fluffy, it's orangey, it's simple, definitely sweet. Sometimes foods can be a great conduit for introducing us to wine, so we might not have ever given a chance previously.
Absolutely. Always less intimidating. Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 270. Have you ever wondered which wine pairs best with your favorite guilty pleasure snack? Why are Cheetos and Twinkies great for learning about wine and food pairing? And how can everyday foods encourage you to try wines you may have otherwise avoided? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions in our chat with Vanessa Price, the author of the best-selling book, Big Macs and Burgundy, Wine Pairings for the Real World. Speaking of books, I wanted to let you know some of our recent winners of our book giveaways. Jennifer Gross in Edmonton and Sarah Lewis from Santa Monica have each won a copy of How to Taste, A Guide to Discovering Flavor and Savoring Life by Mandy Neglich. And Craig Haynes in Ottawa has won a copy of Vignette by Jane Lopes. I still have a copy of Keith Granger's book, Wine Faults and Flaws, A Practical Guide, which won the coveted 2022 Prix d'Orve, to give away. This terrific hardcover book retails for $220. All you have to do is email me and let me know that you'd like to win a copy of Keith's book. I'll choose someone randomly from those who contact me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. Great news! Tantor Media has given me the green light to narrate the audio version of Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much, rather than hiring an actor. And bonus, I can record it from home, rather than having to spend a week in Toronto. Yay! Nothing against Toronto. I just like my yoga pants. I'm really looking forward to this journey, as I am an avid audiobook listener. That's how I read. My eyes get too dry and tired reading physical books. I also devour many podcasts every week, including those on books, writing, film, pop culture, artificial intelligence, tech industry issues, health, happiness, food, and wine, although I do tend to conflate those last three. I'm always listening to something when I go for a walk, putting on makeup, even when I'm going to sleep. It's the only way I can get my mind to press pause for the day. Perhaps I should be listening to more meditation podcasts. Anyway, I'm keen to learn about the process of recording the book, as so much has changed since I did that for my first book, Red, White, and Drunk All Over, A Wine-Soaked Journey from Grape to Glass, which you can get from audible.com. So I will keep you in the loop. If you haven't yet got your copy of Wine Witch on Fire and would like to support it and this podcast that I do for you on a volunteer basis to ensure it continues, please order it from any online book retailer, no matter where you live. It usually arrives within a day or two, and of course the ebook is instant. Every little bit helps spread the message in this book of hope, justice, and resilience. I'll put a link in the show notes to all retailers worldwide at nataliemclean.com/270. If you've read the book or are reading it, I'd love to hear from you at natalie@nataliemclean.com. I'd also love to know which other podcasts you listen to. They don't have to be wine-related, though I'm interested in those too. I'm always looking to expand my playlist. Okay, on with the show. Vanessa Price is the author of the best-selling book, Big Macs and Burgundy, Wine Pairings for the Real World. I just love that title. And she is the wine expert for The Today Show. She has written for and been featured in New York Magazine, Vogue, and many others. Vanessa is a certified level 4 sommelier, the wine director of Wildflower Farms, an auberge resort hotel, as well as the managing partner of Mavericks, the new stylish modern steakhouse in Montauk on the southern shore of Long Island. And she joins us from there, I believe. You're at the restaurant, Vanessa. Welcome.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm actually at my vineyard project on the North Fork at the moment. That's the vineyard in the background.
Oh, you are one busy woman. Wow.
Yes.
Well, thanks for joining us. Thanks for taking the time.
My pleasure.
All right. So now you were born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky by parents, if I understand correctly, who are Southern Baptists. So wine wasn't on your family table. And in fact, you introduced your own grandparents to wine when they were in their 80s. So tell us about that. They have some adorable names. Tell us which wine you introduced to them and why.
Yeah, so my grandparents are Granzy and Hootie, and definitely growing up, alcohol was not a part of, functions, whether they be communal or, family specific or whatever it might be. It was definitely a bit of a taboo. So when I got into the wine industry, I think there was some struggles for my family initially to understand just what that even meant in the abstract. Like, what does that mean to work in wine? And, I think when my grandparents got to the point that they sort of realized that, nope, this is what she's doing with her life, this is the career path that she's headed down, I think they sort of looked at it as, well, maybe we should get to know and understand what it is that she does. And so my grandfather asked me to bring home a bottle of wine for us to share over the holidays. And I remember my dad just about fell out of his chair because he had gone his entire life without his parents drinking. So to suddenly ask me to bring home a bottle. And I remember just being so enthused by the idea. So just sort of like, it's like a tipping point situation. And I remember polling a lot of people and sort of like, what do you think that I should do? What should I bring? And, everybody was like, oh, bring an amazing, like great aged champagne. People love Napa Cab. It was like all of these. And the more I thought about it, the more I was like, my first experiences with wine were very simple. Mm-hmm. The very, very beginning wasn't even necessarily wine. It was Arbor Mist. I used to be an avid collector of Arbor Mist, which is like fermented fruit juice, basically. And, but it was pleasurable to me at the time because it was all that I knew. And so I sort of took that philosophy and sort of ran that through the filter of what I thought would be fun to bring. And so I ultimately ended up bringing a Moscato d'Asti because I thought low in alcohol. So, it's not going to be something that's just going to make them woozy and knock them out. If you've never had alcohol before, it definitely can have an effect very easily. And it's slightly sweet, slightly fizzy. So it's a little bit like, a Coca-Cola or something, but with a little bit of fruitiness and a little bit of alcohol to it. And they absolutely loved it. They finished their glasses and asked for a second one. So.
Wow. Yeah. That's a good conversion story there. And as Moscato d'Asti being from Italy, often only 5% alcohol. So that was a great choice. I agree with you. Yeah. Well done. Did they pair it with anything or did they just have another glass? And
it was more of a, because by the time all of the grandkids, my generation had gotten older, everybody had kind of said, that's been bourbon in my cup or whatever it is, Granzy, Hootie, sorry, but, we do imbibe from time to time. And so I think they just felt like they're being part of the family get together,
Yeah. Awesome. All right. So if you didn't grow up with wine, what was the moment, or maybe there was a wine that really turned you on to wine?
So I actually worked at a winery when I was in college in Kentucky. It was made from Kentucky grapes. They're part of the Ohio River Valley AVA, which is wildly large and encompasses 4 states. It really doesn't mean much in terms of geographical typicity. And the wine was, it was wine. It was fruit wine. Some were vitis vinifera, some were hybrids, lots of, Chambourcin, Sauvignon Blanc, things like that. But it was enough to give me the wine, not because of the wine itself, but because of this culture that seemed to exist around it. It was absolutely fascinating to me how science and history and artistry and culinary, they all seem to sort of intersect in wine. And I just found that so fascinating, this world that was like half technical and half artistry. And it was also just really, it was neat to be at the wine bar and, see how people were excited to dress up and, to have their tasting flights. And it was a special thing that they were sharing. It wasn't like, hammered and having shots of this or, loud bars. there was a ceremony to it, which I found really fascinating. And so I think it was just enough for me to go, this is a really cool thing. I don't think at that time I thought I'm going to figure out how to make this into a lifetime career, but it was enough for me to go, oh, let's see what this is about.
Yeah, great. And so you worked in a variety of capacities within the wine industry, sales and marketing and so on. But I want to jump forward to the point where you wrote a book before you wrote the book that is Big Macs and Burgundy. So what was that book about? What was its focus? It was a wine book?
It was.
it?
So
Yeah,
yes.
okay.
So it's actually under contract right now for my second book. So I can't say too much about what it was. But suffice to say, it was answering a lot of questions that I had when I got into the wine industry that I felt like all of the wine books answered, but answered in a very circuitous and sort of like dense way instead of like a more digestible way. And so I felt like I wanted to speak to people that had that same sort of like crossing of the Rubicon as I did, where it's like, okay, I'm in this industry now. I want to make this stuff make sense to me. I understand that this book has the information that I need, but the dots don't necessarily connect because there's lack of context. And so that was the concept that the book was built around. So hopefully I'll be able to talk more about it soon.
Sure. Dense, circuitous wine writing. Wow, that's new. Not. So will this book be for consumers or for those in the industry or both?
I've tried really hard with Big Macs and Burgundy, and I think that with any future publications that I do, that will probably always be this sort of tightrope that I walk in, which is if you don't know a thing about wine, if you don't know if it's Merlot or Merlot, there's something that you can glean from Big Macs and Burgundy. But even if you are in the industry, most likely there's so much technical information sort of woven throughout the book that, I think that there is still something to be gleaned, even if it's an industry that you've already been in. So I'm hoping to continue that tightrope through any future books.
Awesome. So you wrote this book originally, you wanted to publish it, but then you got some good advice from an upstairs neighbor. Tell us who that was and what he told you needed to do first.
Yeah, I get very gung-ho about things in my life. I decide I'm going to do something. I go full throttle forward. And I knew nothing about the publishing industry. I just decided that I was going to write a book. And my late baby sister was a journalism major, and she was kind enough to help me edit it. And I was like, okay, I wrote this thing. I got somebody to edit it. We're ready to go. And my upstairs neighbor of many, many years, because we both bizarrely lived in our building for a decade plus, is big in the publishing world. And so, I went up and knocked on his door and I was like, okay, I wrote a book. What do I do now? And he was kind of like, slow down, grasshopper. There's a couple steps that you've missed along the way. And one of the big ones is you need bylines. And I was like, what's a byline? I had no idea. And he was like, you need people to publish pieces that you have written, whether it's online or in print, to start to give some validity to your voice, right? People aren't necessarily going to sign you to publish a book when what is your platform? What is your voice? What is your perspective on your world? You haven't established that voice yet. And I was like, got it. And so I had to go back to the drawing board and figure out how to get bylines.
And so one of the first was New York Magazine, which is pretty prestigious. How did you land an article there?
So he ended up being the co-write on my book, actually. He's an extraordinary, talented human being.
Yeah, he was the former executive editor of New York Observer, and he contributed to Vanity Fair as well.
Yeah, no big deal.
Yeah, no, that's pretty good. Good co-author to have.
So, he coached me through it, right? He said, what are some things that you feel that you could have a voice about that would be of interest? And so, really, like at this point, he was just helping me. I think he was just entertained. I would bring him bottles of wine and we would talk. And, one of the things, I forget how it even came up, but I just mentioned something about like fried chicken and champagne, which is one of my favorite pairings and a well-known standard within the industry of being a fun high-low pairing.
Sure.
But for him, that was such a novel thing because I think outside of the industry, people don't necessarily think that somms give ourselves permission to do that high-low, right? Like wine pairing has to be fancy. And so, he said he found that to be very interesting and he thought that perhaps others would too. And so we decided to focus on that and sort of doing the foods that I knew and I grew up with. I grew up with Papa John's and Taco Bell on the dinner table, or like, Mexican pizza casseroles that were made from like canned tamales and refried beans and that sort of thing. So like focusing on those sort of like very approachable, sort of lowbrow foods, but pairing them with significant wines from significant appellations and sort of using that silly food as an avenue to talk about a wine, right? And so that was the idea. And I pitched it a couple of places. New York Magazine thought that it was interesting. They published one. It ended up doing gangbusters on their SEO and, clickbait and all that good stuff.
Wow.
And so
what was the pairing?
The very first one it was for Halloween. And so I decided to pair the most popular. So if you go to candy.com, it'll show you the most popular candy by state, like the most ordered. And the most popular candy in New York State, since it was New York Magazine, were Sour Patch Kids. And so I decided to pair a New York wine. I did a semi-dry Riesling from the Finger Lakes with Sour Patch Kids. And that was my first pairing. And
that's good. I can see how that would work. Yeah.
Yeah, you get a little sweet and a little tang, right? And that's exactly what you need to sort of like have that vein sort of woven through for both.
Sure.
But it did really well, and they asked for another, and then they asked for another, and before I knew it, it was a column.
Oh, wow. And so did it become a weekly or monthly column?
So, it's funny. There was no rhyme or reason to it. Sometimes it was weekly. Sometimes it was every other week. It was published online. And so it really just kind of flowed with thematically a lot of times the foods, because I wouldn't choose the foods. New York Magazine would choose the foods. I would choose the wine pairing and then use that pairing as a way to guide a reader through the education of that wine and then why it works with this silly food. So the foods were often things that, tied into the vein thematically of whatever the magazine was focusing on at that moment.
Okay. And did that then segue into a book? Like, did you think I'll put this together into a book, or did people approach you? How did that transition happen?
Well, that's how I wrote a book to write a book, because, I ended up having publishers, like significant publishers, reaching out to me and going, hey, this column is amazing. We should turn this into a book. And I was going, well, that's really funny because I already wrote one, but no one seems to be interested in that one.
Well, Adam was right about bylines then.
Mm-hmm. Yes, he
Absolutely.
was.
Yeah. So you and Adam worked through kind of which pairings would be in the book. What was your process to figure out, okay, there's a world of pairings out there. Which ones are we going to focus on?
Ooh, so a lot of that was driven by, man, that was a complicated one. It was so complicated because the book isn't just food and wine pairing, right? It's also the story of my trajectory of being a kid from a Southern Baptist family in Kentucky and moving to the Big Apple and making it in, this, very sort of prestigious and often perceived as snooty. I don't necessarily think that it is, but perceived as a snooty industry. And so that story that was sort of woven throughout the book. And so ultimately the way we decided to categorize it was to have the foods follow the trajectory of my story. So, starting in Kentucky with Southern foods, introducing the people to things like beer cheese, talking about fried chicken, that
what
sort
is
of thing.
Beer cheese? You have to tell us.
It's what it sounds like. It's melted cheese with beer in it.
Oh, okay.
It's just absolutely delightful. You dip pretzels in it. You dip like soft baked yummy pretzels.
So it's like a creamy dip or something.
Yes, exactly.
And what was their wine pairing for that one?
Oh my gosh, I've forgotten what I did with beer cheese. I've got the book here. So there's over 300 food and wine pairings in the book. So the way it was sort of ended up being woven was that, so if you look at it, it's everything from Southern food to gas station food to trying to make it in the city broke food to, I ended up working for a very prestigious importer and all of the incredible meals that came along with that, like dining at Le Bernardin and some of the greatest dining establishments in the world. So the book follows all of those avenues, right? There's healthy food chapters and things like that. So it kind of runs the gamut.
Oh, that's great. Great way to structure it. So why did you decide to pair wine with 100 different candies?
So that came out of a conversation, actually. So one of the best ways that Adam and I worked together was that we often disagreed. And so, a lot of times the best comes out of those sort of disagreements. And one of the things was that he said that he just didn't think that dessert wine was that interesting. And I had said, well, not only do I think that dessert wine is that interesting, I think that there's such a diversity in the world of wine that you could build an entire food org chart based off of it. And, that's sort of what drove what ended up becoming the candy listicle, which is, if you look through it, that is 100 candies paired with 100 dessert wines, and not a single dessert wine is repeated once.
Wow. Wow. Wow, that's incredible. I didn't know there were that many different dessert wines
And on
and
top
styles.
of that, to tell you how seriously I took it, 2 masters of wine signed off on my pairings for all 100 wines.
That's great. You are thorough.
I got the notes and the why this, but we could this. It's actually very entertaining to have a master of wine talk to you about but is the saltiness level in the Snickers really sufficient? It's it was a lot of fun.
Get into a technical debate. So let's get into some of those. Which wine did you pair with Cheetos?
So Cheetos was probably one of the ones that, people just really didn't know what to do with that one. They were just, aghast that I had paired wine with Cheetos, but it was Sancerre.
Oh, okay. So a Sauvignon Blanc from the Loire Valley. Why did you go with that? Why is that one working?
So one of the reasons that sort of silly foods are so great for food and wine pairing analysis is because they are more simplistic, right? When you talk about a composed dish, there's so many variables. What is the protein? How was it prepared? Was it grilled? Was it smoked? Was it sous vide? Was it baked? Was it roasted? What was the accoutrement that went with it? Was it citrus? Was it a cream base? Was it, a bouillabaisse? There's so many different layers to a composed dish that pairing becomes more complicated. When you talk about simple foods like Cheetos, because the food is so primary, it actually becomes an easier way to talk about food and wine pairing because it's so literal, right? There's less nuance to it.
Sure.
So for a Cheeto, what is a Cheeto? A Cheeto is salty, that orange sort of stickiness, that we gets stuck on our fingers
that
and
dust.
We can't get off.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Orange
it creates
dust.
that sort of chewy sensation in our mouth, something that we need to clear our palate from. So it's really sort of very straightforward in terms of what it's got a little bit of crunch to it. So that's what a Cheeto is. So when you think about Sancerre, you think about a mineral-driven white wine that is wildly high in acid, right? So that minerality, that salinity complements the saltiness of the Cheeto, and that high acidity sort of works like a squeegee, pulling all of that sticky sort of gunky stuff out of your mouth and just sort of leaving you with all of the pleasurable sensations behind.
Sure. So would another high acid white work, like a Gruner Veltliner?
I think so. Sure.
Okay.
The reason I specifically chose Sancerre is because of, the mineral expression is so specifically saline driven and the acid is so specifically high. But sure, that's the thing about food and wine pairing. There's no absolute right or wrong answer.
Absolutely. Oh, yes.
Brazilian sparkling wine. That's what I paired with.
The beer cheese?
Yes, with the beer cheese. Because the same way I didn't want to repeat a candy throughout the book, I also never repeated a wine. And I
thought it might be a bubbly. Yeah. No, that's brilliant. Yeah.
It was a bubble, and I went with Brazil because I really wanted to be inclusive of discoveries that could be found all around the world.
All right. Well, then how about licorice?
Ooh, licorice is a fun one. Licorice, but that's where it's are you talking about red licorice? Or you're talking about black licorice?
You choose.
When you talk about black licorice, you need something that sort of matches that same sort of bitter quality, right? So it's quite literally licorice. So if you have something that has that actual quina in it, that's what quina root is what produces that licorella sort of licorice impression. Think about star anise.
Yes.
Exactly. So quina root is what is actually added to Barolo Chinato, which is a style of dessert wine coming from Piedmont, northern Italy, where the famous Barolo is produced. Barolo Chinatos are Barolos that have had a proprietary family recipe plus quina root added to the barrels and allowed to macerate, and perhaps there is a fortification and a slight dose of sugar to give it that sweetness, but it's very bitter, sweet wine with that licorice impression.
Huh. Oh, that'd be brilliant. I want to try that for sure. How about Twinkies?
So Twinkies I did with Sauterne. So that one was also a lot of fun because there's a famous restaurant in Midtown called The Grill, which is part of the Major Food Group, and they very famously have 3 centuries of Chateau Yquem on their list. And I mentioned this because this is actually one of the pairings that was from New York Magazine that we carried over to the book. And, I had mentioned they might let you BYOT if you got a bottle of their Yquem. And then I think
your own Twinkies.
They ended up having a couple people like asked to do it. They were like, we're going to have a bottle of Echem. Can we bring a Twinkie? And I think they like plated them for it and gave them a fork and a knife. So there's a lot of fun in that. Yeah.
Oh my God, great stories. S'mores.
S'mores. What did I do with s'mores? I did a Recioto della Valpolicella. So that was one that was a little bit more confounding for me.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bizarre mix of very sweet, subtle bitterness of the chocolate, the saccharine sort of like smoked character of the marshmallow, the drying sweet sensation of the graham cracker. Like there was a lot going on. And, it seemed like ports didn't do it, Madeiras didn't do it, ice wines didn't do it. I was having a really hard time finding one that worked and ended up finding, so Recioto della Valpolicella is the dessert wine coming from the Veneto, which is where Amarone is made.
Mm-hmm.
So it's basically made in the same style as Amarone, but the grapes are actually dehydrated to a greater level. And when the fermentation happens, there's actual sugar left. So again, there's a bitterness and a sweet component to it. So red sweet wines are less common than white sweet wines, but they have a lot of great application.
Okay. Cronuts, which is that magical combination of a donut and a cruller, is it?
What did I pair it with cronuts? I'm going to have to look and see.
They are, was that a New York invention? Cronuts?
Yes. So, it's something that kind of like people line up out the door. So I did a section that was on like all the Instagrammable foods, because essentially cronuts is like, you put that on the gram if you got in line and you waited in that line and you were able to get one of those, because that is really what it was. Like it was it was like a line out the door situation, but then even once you got in that line, you weren't guaranteed to actually get one. So I did an Anderson Valley sparkling wine. So something that had that sparkling character to sort of go against that yeasty sort of quality, right? So if you have that yeastiness in your wine and then you have that yeastiness in your half croissant, half donut, but something that has a little bit more riper, fruitier character, which new world sparkling wines tend to give you more than old world sparkling wines. And especially something from California, it's just going to have a little bit more power behind it. And the Anderson Valley makes some amazing sparkling wines that are much less known than some of their Carneros or Sonoma or Santa Barbara counterparts.
Wow, okay. And the Circus peanuts, which are those neon orange marshmallows, which just look ghastly, but where'd you go with those?
Did I do with those? You're putting me on the spot here. Let me find my listicle.
Something orangey, maybe, in wines?
What did I do with those Circus peanuts? The good thing about it is it's all in
the book, which people
it's all in the book, and it's all, that's right, I did orange muscat.
Okay, an orange wine.
Something that people might not have had very often, but that's a literal orange and orange.
Yeah.
Sort of, you typically find them in California.
Okay.
But it's a literal interpretation in a wine form of a Circus peanut. It's round, it's fluffy, it's orangey, it's simple, definitely sweet, just like a Circus peanut. It's funny, I remember now, Som TV tested a lot of the pairings that were in the listicle, and that was one of them. And they remember being fascinated because they thought it was the first application they'd ever heard of where they were actually interested in drinking an orange muscat. So sometimes foods can be a great conduit for introducing us to wines that we might not have ever given a chance previously.
Absolutely. Always less intimidating. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Vanessa. Here are my takeaways. Number one, I like the fun and creative way that Vanessa has explored the concept of high-low pairings, including which wines go with our favorite guilty pleasure snacks. Number two, she makes a great point that snacks like Cheetos and Twinkies are great for learning about wine and food pairing because they are simpler in flavor and texture, so it's easier to understand what will pair well with them. And number three, I liked her examples of how everyday foods encourage you to try wines you may have otherwise avoided. She talked about Circus peanuts, how they helped her discover orange muscat for the first time. In the show notes, you'll find the full transcript of my conversation with Vanessa, links to her website and books, the video versions of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live, and where you can order my book online no matter where you live. You'll also find a link to take my free online food and wine pairing class called The 5 Wine and Food Pairing Mistakes That Can Ruin Your Dinner and How to Fix Them Forever at nataliemclean.com/class. class. That's all in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/270. Email me if you have a sip tip question, if you've read my book or are in the process of reading it, at natalie@nataliemclean.com. If you have suggestions on how to improve this podcast or guests I should interview, please let me know. I'd love to hear from you. If you missed episode 197, go back and take a listen. I chat with podcaster Lori Budd about how to detect wine aromas by tasting candy, as well as heading south to find great value wines. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite. I'm a wine cheapskate at heart. There's a thrill of the hunt when you can find a wine that tastes twice as much as it cost. Like if you go to a discount warehouse outlet store and you find a Versace jacket that's 10% of its original cost. And one of my biggest tips that came out of that book was go south. So a lot of the badge or name regions in many countries are expensive. So if you think Tuscany and Piedmont, if you go south, you're going to get deals from Sicily. Even in California, Napa and Sonoma, go south to Paso Robles or Santa Cruz, and you're going to find much more affordable wines. You won't want to miss next week when we continue our chat with Vanessa. If you liked this episode or learned something from it, please email or tell one friend about it this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in the wines, tips, and stories we shared. It's easy to find my podcast. Just tell them to search for Natalie McLean Wine on their favorite podcast app. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a wine that pairs perfectly with Circus peanuts or Cheetos. Likely, that would be an orange muscat. 3 for 3 with orange all around. Cheers. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.